Hello, and welcome to the Further podcast, where we explore the far reaches of the human experience, from missions to Mars to skydiving to blowing one's mind with psychoactive substances. These conversations offer insight into how these extreme experiences showcase the human spirit and just might teach us how to live our everyday lives a bit better. I'm your host, Haley Maria Duran, and I study the effects of psychedelics and other out-there experiences on people's minds and brains. All right, so we are here with Kathleen Thompson. I first met her during the first round of psychedelics back in 2021. So she spoke there about Kambo. So it's quite exciting kind of to have this be full circle and to bring her back on another sort of science communication project. So she focuses on researching Kambo and is also a Kambo practitioner. So do you want to tell us a bit about Kambo briefly for people who don't really know much about it?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for inviting me on to have this conversation with you. So, Kambo is an Amazonian medicine that comes from the skin secretion of a very specific species of tree frog called Phyllomedusa bicolour. And in this secretion, there's this rich supply of bioactive peptides that have these really potent physiological effects. So, it was traditionally used by a number of indigenous communities in the Amazon basin area, so primarily Peru and Brazil, but these frogs also live in parts of the Amazon basin in Ecuador and Colombia and even parts of Venezuela. And there's very different and unique ways that these different communities have used Kambo. So when I talk about traditional use, just know that can vary from community to community, from tribe to tribe, but typically it's applied through superficial burns that are made on the skin, usually the upper arm or the lower leg, and the secretion is applied to the burns, and then within 30 seconds to a minute, these peptides go into circulation and cause very profound physiological responses that can result in vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, facial swelling, heat flushing, sweating, shaking, and just feeling quite uncomfortable. The Kambo experience can express itself in a lot of different ways, but usually nauseating, vomiting is part of the process for most people. And traditionally, they would do this ritual before going on these long multi-day hunts. And they found it would help them increase their endurance, their resilience, their visual acuity, their night vision, and their ability to be perceptive while navigating the jungle and attuning to their senses. It was also used for something called panema, which is kind of just this term that describes like a bad luck cloud of funk that someone may have. So, if somebody's kind of been a little off and they've been, missing when they shoot these animals on these hunts, they might say, oh, you have some panema, you have some bad luck. And then they'll do Kambo to kind of disperse that panema and then bring clarity and accuracy again. So despite what a lot of people believe, most of the traditional use of Kambo was not actually really for the same reasons that we find Kambo being used today by the more global world. These days, you're seeing it used a lot more for these psycho-spiritual, emotional affects that people are experiencing, and they would predominantly use it for hunting magic in the Amazon. It doesn't mean they didn't use it as a medicine. Like, they certainly would use it for infections and snake bites and spider bites and malaria and things like that. But for them, it was predominantly like an adaptogenic magical tool that they would use. So the practice of Kambo in the last 30 years or so has really evolved to adapt to the needs of the modern world and the people that are using it outside of the jungle.
Yeah, it's interesting because to me, like, I kind of associate Kambo with a sort of similar group of people as people who might do ayahuasca or some other sort of plant medicine ceremony. And it sounds like initially the use of Kambo in these indigenous communities, it's very different than what a lot of the West is being drawn to it for. So,
Yeah, yeah, there's a very common misconception that there's like this deep shamanic practice, traditionally speaking, around the use of Kambo, and that's actually not really true. Now, there are some communities that may have like songs and stuff around the use of Kambo, but for the most part, it's a very casual experience. It's nothing at all like ayahuasca, where there's like this rich history of shamanic practices and spirituality associated with that modality. And so I think people just don't know that. And unfortunately, because like you said, a lot of the people that are using Kambo are tangential in the psychedelic space. So the vast majority of people using Kambo are psychedelic users. They're experienced with psychedelics. And what's happening is people are sort of translating the guidelines or philosophies of psychedelic use, perhaps like ayahuasca or iboga or some of these other traditional rituals, and they are somewhat inappropriately trying to translate them to the practice of Kambo, and they're making all these assumptions about the
mm,
traditional origins of Kambo in the process, and they're making assumptions about preparation guidelines or, spirituality and things like that. And I find this actually to be dangerous because Kambo is really its own unique tool. It's its own modality, and there's nothing else like it in this entire planet so far that we've found. It's very unique, and it even though like it's kind of in the same fringe space and it's still an Amazonian medicine and it can be mind expansive in its own manner, it really cannot be equated to the psychedelic experience because it's its own completely different thing.
yeah, it's interesting that people are taking a framework that they've become familiar with and sort of projecting it onto something completely different. I believe I read that there's a bunch of different active components of Kambo, but like some of these psychoactive components are actually opioids. So quite a different experience. Just like with how you've seen people sort of try to bring it into the West, what are some of the things that people are sort of adding on that are different than how it might be used in its original settings?
Yeah, there's been a number of modernizations and adaptations, which I think are actually appropriate. Um, so first of all, the process of drinking water in the ritual was a more recent addition to the practice. That was kind of formed by the caboclo, which is like mestizo mixed lineage when Europeans started conquering areas of South America and then mixing with the indigenous populations. They essentially created these like mixed caboclo peoples. And that's when the water drinking protocols kind of got introduced. Also, the whole aspect of ceremony and ritual and intention setting and burning sage and playing music and singing, that's all new. And it's, in line with like the neo-spiritual adaptation, which personally I'm a big fan of. I think when you take human consciousness and you give it an opportunity to create meaning by witnessing ritual and articulating intentions and creating this whole like observable phenomena to really fuel the conscious intention to have healing occur. I think that's really powerful. So I'm I'm certainly one for innovation because I think that the people that are using Kambo in this way with this extra ceremonialization. I think they need that in order to cultivate a deeper spiritual connection with themselves and with the world and with the process. Um, Also, the different areas of the body, there's been all these different protocols and strategies sort of developed over the last 20 years or so around placing the medicine in different parts of the body. For example, you can put on the spine to target different chakras. You can apply to different acupuncture meridians that correspond to different organ systems which are connected to certain emotions based on Chinese medicine theory. And you can also do auricular points on the ears, again, utilizing acupuncture points based on the traditional Chinese model. So there's all sorts of really interesting evolutions happening in the Kambo space, and it's happening so rapidly, and there's all this creativity that's going on, and some of it, sometimes there is wisdom to doing things a certain way for millennia, and then sometimes there is room for innovation, especially as the needs and the ways of applying a medicine change. And we're seeing this in the psychedelic space as well, right? Like there's so many ways that like an ayahuasca circle or an iboga circle or whatever is going to be a lot different than if you do it with its indigenous origins. I'm sure that they don't have, an AED on site in Gabon if someone goes into cardiac arrest. I'm sure they don't have IV fluids ready to go. I'm sure they're not screening people with EKGs and stuff like that. So I do think it's a good thing ultimately to allow modalities and allow the spirit of a medicine to grow and change just like the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point you make that, blending different practices together. Some people are kind of see that as it getting watered down, but it's also adapting it to fit the needs of the community. And through that, you get all sorts of interesting syncretic practices. Like, who would have thought Chinese medicine and an Amazonian frog? Like, that's pretty out there. And I think it is a good thing, but I understand that you've also spent quite a bit of time trying to actually work with some of these indigenous communities in the Amazon and learning from them. So maybe you could tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, and I think that's important to mention because sometimes, like you said, there can be resistance to the idea of embracing mixing of different like cultures or traditions and things like that. But if you don't have the experience with the traditional origins of something, it can make your opinion less credible, right? But I've spent a lot of time with indigenous communities, in particular the Matsés. I've spent a lot of time with them in their homes, with their children, with their family, learning to speak their language, um, watching how they interact with Kambo medicine, asking them about what their historical use is, when do they use it, why do they use it, and I've been with them when they're using it. And I think all of that experience has led me to have a really balanced perspective of the opinion that we really need to have discernment around which things that we keep and which things that we are open to letting change as time goes on. But my time with these indigenous communities is precious time to me. It's hard to really understand a medicine without spending real time at the source of where it comes from. And it doesn't mean that you can't be a good practitioner if you haven't gone to the jungle. There's lots of people that I think are very good practitioners out there that haven't yet met the frog, but there is a lot that you will not understand until you are there in person, looking at this frog in the face and spending time with the people who have pioneered this technology and are guardians of the jungle. And it just helps you have a more full picture of understanding the context of how this was originally used, where it comes from, and also how precious it is. When you go to the jungle and you watch a Matsés man crawl up a 40-foot tree in the middle of the night where there's vipers and uh, mosquitoes, and I mean, it's dangerous, right? And they go up there to find a frog and bring it down, and then they discover it has no secretion to offer. You realize how really lucky and privileged we are to have access to a medicine that is so rare and so precious and so difficult to obtain. And it really changes your regard for the substance. It also makes you much more conservative with using that substance and, using minimal effective doses, so that you're not wasting it, or not serving to people that aren't going to take it seriously, that aren't going to really respect how far that medicine had to come in order to reach them and be accessible. So I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from spending time in the jungle, is just coming back to gratitude and respect and reciprocity, and not taking this substance or this experience for granted.
Yeah, you definitely bring up some really interesting points. Like people are literally sort of, I mean, it kind of sounds like almost risking their lives to catch the frog, or at least doing like dangerous activities because it's so revered in their culture. And yet, I think you can go on Etsy and buy supposedly Kambo sticks, which is just wild to me that people might be able to do that. So it really sort of, like, I'm wondering, like, if there was suddenly a Kambo, like, boom, if it became something like 5-MeO DMT, which is, I think, gaining quite a bit of popularity, um, how would you be able to, like, deal with that? How would the Kambo community handle that?
Yeah, I mean, it is exploding right now as we speak, and it's going to continue. And this is a problem. And I think we need to act fast as a community. And I do have concerns about the sustainability. We're already seeing frogs being over harvested because I'm on the ground there. I see these frogs that are showing signs of stress and being depleted and being milked too often. And that's another reason why sourcing is so important. When you do buy something off eBay, you have no idea where it's coming from. You don't know how those frogs were treated. You don't know if they were given enough time to recover their secretion. You don't even know if it's the correct species of frog, which can be dangerous if you get a different frog, or if it's adulterated with egg whites or yucca, because that's a thing that's now happening too, is like fake Kambo sticks, or that they're mixed with like egg whites and things like that. And that can cause immune responses that are not safe for people. Um, so yeah, it's an issue, and I, my suspicion is that there's two things that are going to potentially be the solution to that. One, which would likely be to set up some sort of reserve territories where the people that are stewarding that land can ensure that frogs are being harvested from and milked in respectful ways. And I also don't even know how practical that is. I don't know if you essentially try to create like a frog farm, even if it's in a wild environment that they're very, happy in. I don't know if you put a concentration of frogs together, if that will affect their ability to thrive. We don't really even know like how long do they actually need to recover their secretion. A lot of these indigenous people, they try to give them 3 months in between, but
Hmm.
how do they know when 3 months has happened? They're really looking for, does this frog have marks on its wrist from being tied up in the past? And that's telling them that um, maybe that frog hasn't had enough time to replenish the secretion. So I think some sort of like reserve preserve situation could help, of course, in theory. I don't think anyone's done it successfully yet, and I know some people are trying, so it'd be interesting to see in the next few years how successful those efforts are. And then personally, I think that if this trend continues to grow and the demand continues to increase, creating some sort of synthetic alternative, just like we've seen with 5-MeO DMT, I think is going to be really necessary. And I'm sure that some people's first instinct is like, that's bastardizing Kambo and, exploiting it or whatever. And sure, that's one perspective, but I actually, when I really think about it, um, there's so many people that they're more attached to the outcome of Kambo, less so than the experience of it coming from a frog, right? Or even from an
Mm.
indigenous community. When you have stage 4 breast cancer, or you have Lyme disease, or you have treatment resistant depression, you're when you've reached a point when you're willing to do some crazy shit like get burned and have frog poison rubbed into it and barf all over yourself, chances are you've exhausted a lot of conventional options. And that's what I find to be true is a lot of people, they're like, you know what? I'm just down to try whatever crazy stuff may work. And so they don't necessarily care that it comes from a frog. And those people deserve healing too. So I think that if you were to create some sort of synthetic Kambo type substance, it's never going to be Kambo, right? Because that is so complex and so magical in its own way, and there is an intelligence to it, and there is a spirit to it. But you create something that's more or less a gift from Kambo. And
Hmm.
I really do believe that Kambo is trying to teach us how to create a healing aid that is inspired from it. And I don't think that that's disrespectful. I think it is actually the frog moving through the world and trying to continue spreading its reach and healing people. So that could potentially look like it going through drug development and becoming like an FDA approved substance that's very standardized, that's, pharmaceutical grade. And there's so many questions with that too. It's like, okay, well, are people still purging? Do they need to purge in order for the spiritual and physical benefits to even manifest? And it's similar questions that we have in the psychedelic space is like, well, how important is like the mystical experience or the challenging experience or the vomiting or whatever? How important are all these aspects of the organic experience to the outcome? And we don't have the answer. We don't know how much of it is just peptide magic versus, peptides plus the ritualization plus things like vomiting that are going to, regulate vagal nerve tone and the gut brain axis and things like that. It's so hard to know, and it would be quite a stretch to bring something like this into Western medicine. I don't even
Hmm.
know if it's possible, and it's something that I would love to contribute to, but I do think that that is potentially a solution that could take pressure off the frogs by providing a medicine that helps people heal in the ways that they need it without it needing to come from the crude origins of an animal with a nervous system.
That makes sense. It's just, with a substance that's so complex, there's so many more steps than you would see for getting something like iboga to market because we don't even know like what is actually the most important, substance in Kambo. And, there seems to be an emphasis on it for physical conditions, which is different than a lot of psychedelics. And then it's like, oh, well, there could be multiple components that are helping each indication, and these could be different. And so it's a huge process to sort of disentangle that. But I do
Mm-hmm.
think that just with the crowd that seems to be being drawn to it, that it really is a testament to the like psychological element as well. Like this ritual is elaborate. Like being burned with a stick, purging, all of that, that is an ordeal. And I'm just imagining, how would you even control for that psychological element, you know?
Yeah, you can't really tease them apart. I mean, I always wonder if you rub some like niacin in somebody's arm, it might be a good placebo, but and then you could do the ritual. And that is further studies that I would like to do is to actually see if the differences in the outcomes are affected by whether there's a ritual versus whether it's applied in a somewhat clinical way. Um, and we actually are seeing in the data set that we just completed that the person's intention had a significant impact on their um, their psychological outcomes with all these psychometric scales that we administered. So we found that people that reported doing Kambo for purely physical reasons, they actually didn't have as profound effects psychologically speaking on, mindfulness and emotional wellness and life satisfaction and depression symptomology, etc. But people who reported doing Kambo for psychological and or spiritual reasons, they actually got more, objectively speaking, out of the experience. And so even though I think some people do kind of show up, with this like very like simple way of thinking about Kambo as this detox modality, which is really a very unsophisticated and somewhat disrespectful way of thinking about it because it is so much more complex than that. It is so much more astute than that. And yeah, I do think, when things are modulated and you are brought back into a homeostatic place, both biochemically, spiritually, and mentally, then yes, detoxification mechanisms work better. So I think these health effects are actually byproducts of these deeper psychosomatic effects that are happening for people. But I do think that the container is a big part of whether that person can work with the consciousness aspect and
Mm.
augment the psychosomatic parts of the experience. And that's why I think the addition of a ceremony, of a ritual, is super beneficial because these days people are so disembodied, they're detached, they're disassociated from themselves, and until they're really like able to integrate their physiology with their spirit, um, they'll often continue to be disconnected from themselves.
It's interesting because it sounds like in some ways, intention is kind of a bit like expectancy effect. Like they're expecting, that this could have a psychological benefit. And, there's been a lot of talk in the psychedelic world about that being problematic. But it also, out there sort of in the real world with when people are just trying to improve their well-being, it's actually a good thing to have expectancies. Like, why
Yeah.
not think something is going to work? So it's kind of interesting that to some extent your research is noting something similar to that. But going back to the actual Amazonian communities who are using it, it sounds like there it's more of a physical treatment for things, or what?
I think so. I mean, the way that they live their life so integrated into the jungle and with nature, it's like they don't have a lot of frill or special ways of operating in order to facilitate their deep connection to the jungle and to spirits, because that's their default, that's their worldview anyways. So I think for them, yeah, there is like a bit of casualness where it's like taking a vitamin. You just sit on a log and then they do it, and there's not like a lot of like sacredness in the ways that you kind of see in the West. And that's because every part of their life is sacred to them. Every animal, every time they kill something, every time they eat something, every time they are in the jungle with the trees and the forest and the creatures. So for them, there's not much of a differentiation, and therefore, yeah, there's less of a emphasis on the practice being this like really important spiritual thing that needs all this like extra fluff around it. They just like sit on a log, do it, move on with their day.
Wow, so casual.
Hmm.
It so why might somebody in those communities, why might they use Kambo and who might use it?
Yeah, I mean, they're not hunting as much as they used to these days. Now, some of these communities have access to like bullets and guns and things like that. So I guess they're still hunting in that way, but they're not using their bows and arrows as much as they used to. And they also have chickens running around. So parts of their culture are diminishing for sure. But I think at this point, they usually just use it for illnesses now in the more modern context of things. Definitely during COVID, a lot of them were taking Kambo for COVID, and a lot of the Matsés got COVID, and I don't think there was one single death that happened in their total community. There's about 3,000 Matsés people, and I'm sure 60 to 80% of them had COVID at some point. Um, and they also use it for, when they need to take a long walk. For example, one of the communities that I visit often, there's like a 6 mile walk in and out of the village, and you often have to carry a bunch of supplies and stuff, and it can be hot and difficult. So sometimes they'll take Kambo the morning before the walk so that they have the stamina to go into Iquitos and get more supplies. Um, but honestly, sometimes they just take it because it's available. I mean, I've asked them before, like, well, how many times do you take it in a month? Do you have a limit? And they're like, no, we just take it when it rains and the frogs come down. Like, if the frogs are easy to get, if we hear them singing and we know they're there, we'll just do it because it's there. And it's just part of their life. Their children start taking Kambo from very early on, usually at least by 3 years old, sometimes earlier if the baby's sick for some reason. They'll give it to newborns, even. They'll give it to infants that are less than 6 months if they have some sort of ailment that they need help with. But usually around like 3 or 4 years of age is when they start ritualistically taking it as just part of their cultural norm.
Wow. It's interesting because, that sounds shocking to many people to think about, young, very, very young children, infants in some cases, being exposed to something that is so powerful, physiologically, it seems. And yet, I know that, like, Native American churches that use peyote, they will also have young children use that. So I don't know. It's just, I guess it does say something perhaps about the physiological safety that, they're able to use it without any ill consequences, apparently at least. So,
Yeah, I mean, they have hundreds and hundreds of years, if not longer, of long-term regular use of it, and there doesn't seem to be any obvious long-term consequences from using Kambo, at least not with their, lifestyle, genetics, and need for it. But that's not necessarily the case for someone who's living outside of the Amazon. Like, for example, when you're living in the Amazon and you're drinking dirty river water and you're literally combating bacteria that are trying to kill you every day, then having a regular, like, immune boosting substance such as Kambo and creating this like hypervigilance of your immune system is really functional. It makes a lot of sense, and it probably keeps people healthy and alive when they're waging war with pathogens every day. Now, if you are in the US where you have sterilized tap water and there's not like a tropical climate and there's just not the same types of infectious organisms, and you're using Kambo at the frequency of a Matsés person, you're going to start to have like hypervigilance of your immune function, you might start experiencing allergies or rashes or different like histamine responses and things like that. So there is such thing as too much Kambo, but for them, with their genetics, with their environment that they're in, within the context of how they're living, it seems extremely safe. It seems like long term to not be causing any problems, but we can't make that assumption about somebody who's in the West. You know, a 40-year-old Matsés man is not the same as a 40-year-old man with diabetes from Texas. Like, Matsés man has been taking Kambo since he was a child. His microbiome is probably twice as diverse. His immune function is probably way more robust. His diet is completely different. I'm sure his mitochondrial function is different. His aerobic activity is different. Like, you just cannot apply the same principles to an indigenous person who's living in the jungle to a modern person in a Western culture. And that's why I think it's important that we don't just take every traditional perspective and method and assume that it's appropriate for the global use of something that has left the jungle.
There's definitely a lot to unpack there. I had not really, I guess, thought about how contextually different, like, the immune environment, I suppose you could say, is for an indigenous person, and that probably has a tremendous modulating effect. Because if you go on, like, PubMed and you search Kambo, a lot of things that come up seem to be case reports from people having pretty bizarre effects that I'm not really sure are attributable to Kambo, because a lot of them are one-off, sudden death,
Mm-hmm.
psychosis, all this stuff. So it paints it in a very sort of negative light. So I don't
Mm-hmm.
know.
Yeah, unfortunately, most of the stuff that is published are case reports of harm. And in my opinion, the vast majority of harms associated with Kambo are totally avoidable. Most of the time, they're actually due to hyponatremia, which is electrolyte disturbances, and people with improper water drinking protocols. And, usually they're combining ayahuasca and Kambo. They're on these no salt diets, and then they're purging all night on the ayahuasca, and then they're taking Kambo in between ceremonies, and they have no salt in their system, no potassium, and then they drink 2 liters of water, whatever, and then they get hyponatremia and they die or go into a coma or need to be hospitalized. And so a lot of it is just like lack of training. Um, and I do think that there are certain people that can get pushed into imbalanced neurochemical states that are already kind of riding on the edge, and that could potentially maybe push someone into psychosis. I do think that is possible. But yeah, it's this is part of what I'm trying to change as a scientist. It's like, let's bounce the narrative a little bit. Let's talk about some of the amazing things that Kambo is doing for people. Because for those, 15 whatever case reports that are out there that exist in the world, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are taking Kambo safely, who are not being harmed, and who are having amazing experiences, miraculous healing experiences of diseases, of cancer, of depression, of trauma, of spiritual incongruence. And it's like, hold on, okay, I'm not saying that it's risk free, because nothing is in this world, but this is a severely imbalanced conversation. And the study that wrapping up now and trying to get published soon, it's really the first study actually measuring the benefits of Kambo and showing that there's not really evidence that it's actually harming people in the ways that it has been suggested through these biased publications.
Yeah, it's definitely something that requires a lot of balance, because, if everything was super positive about Kambo, then you might get into a situation where there is a lot of over harvesting really quickly without, developing an alternative. And that almost could create more issues long term and people using it unsafely in such a way where they are developing conditions due to like just drinking too much water and whatnot. So, and I did see that you had done a study looking at risk as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, like the first study I published was very simple, like demographics and some physiological information from my own personal practice. It was over like a 10-month period, maybe 240 sessions or so. And, we looked at like the intention that people have, reasons for doing Kambo, and there were no adverse events reported. I mean, I've personally served thousands of people, and I've never had an emergency. I've never had to take someone to a hospital. I've never had to receive any sort of emergency care for any of my clients. And I think when you follow a few really essential safety protocols, Kambo is actually an amazingly safe and forgiving substance. There's tons of people out there with no training, with no understanding, serving it in very reckless ways. And surprisingly, there's not more accidents. So honestly, I think it's probably safer than a lot of drugs on the market where there's just a known like, number of people that are going to have these adverse reactions.
It seems like at least when it is administered by somebody who is a practitioner that there's not that many serious adverse events, but there are physiological issues that can happen, like fainting. I think I read happens in like 10% of people, and I'm just imagining that could scare like a drug development company off of Kambo or something like that, even though it seems to be something that is expected and isn't doesn't seem to have like a long-term harm for people. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's kind of why I wonder, if the medical model is really even ready or open-minded enough for something that challenges a lot of the paradigms of thinking. Because, some people will describe the effects of Kambo as adverse effects: vomiting, nausea, facial swelling, sweating. But these are not necessarily adverse effects, they are the effects themselves. And so you can't have an experience without these effects being present and get the benefits. And so when you look at it from that perspective, well, yeah, like all of the effects are adverse. That's the point. It sucks. It's uncomfortable. It's not fun, but it works. So I think we have to really change the way that we think about interventions and what's acceptable and what's a side effect and what's the effect itself before we could ever incorporate something that's even similar to Kambo into being available clinically.
Mm. Yeah, it really sounds like one of those, I guess, interventions you could say that's really like a stress up to stress down. So
Hmm.
something like a sauna or, cold exposure, like these are less in a lot of ways extreme, but they're also, causing that physiological stress response. And then people are becoming more regulated afterwards.
Yeah, I really believe that part of the magic of this substance is the hermetic effects that it induces. It really kind of stimulates these core systems in the body, such as the nervous system, the cardiovascular system, the gastrointestinal system, to remodulate, and it like disrupts them in a way that it provides the body with an opportunity to have these regulatory feedback mechanisms restore some intelligence to the biorhythms, and bringing that person back to their customized, balanced place.
So I guess, like, with all the potential benefits of Cambo for some people, but yet, all this concern about it potentially being unsustainable. If a person is thinking about doing this, perhaps, what are some signs that they maybe really should consider it or should not do it?
Yeah, I mean, with a lot of interest in what I call Kambo tourism, I think it's important that someone has like a real calling, that they're really feeling an authentic draw other than just some curiosity. Because if you just show up and you don't really have a reason to be there, you're not going to really participate with creating meaning as much from that experience. Whereas if you know why you're there and you have a real intention, I think it's going to give a lot more weight to the experience. And considering how precious of a substance it is, making sure that you don't disregard the importance of really seizing that opportunity. Um, Also, I think really vetting your practitioner that you choose is very important, not only for your safety, but also for helping support sustainability. Asking your practitioner, where do they get their medicine from? Do they know these communities directly that they're receiving the medicine from? Or perhaps they're part of an organization. And if they can't answer that, then there is a disconnect there, and there is some caution to take around how in alignment they are with deep integrity in their commitments to carrying this medicine. Um, but for sure, asking them a number of questions also about, their training credentials, how long they have been serving, what safety protocols that they have in place. Are they CPR certified? If they're not administering a medical questionnaire to you, run. There's no reason that someone shouldn't be medically screened before doing Kambo. There's a lot of these backyard trainings that have come out of the woodworks because there is no regulatory body, there's no real authority in this space. And so anyone that decides that they think that they're a master practitioner, and trust me, a lot of people who've been serving for like a year and a half, 2 years, think that they're master practitioners, and then they start these training programs that are 3 days long, and then they're taking people in and certifying them, and these people are leaving that training thinking that they are qualified to serve this medicine to other people, and that's just not the case. So making sure that somebody has gone through an effective and reputable training that's at least 10 to 14 days is really important in my opinion. And if they can't answer your questions about safety protocols, then they might not be utilizing any, which is concerning. I think every practitioner for a first time recipient should be administering a test point. There should be certain water drinking protocols and limitations in place. There should be fainting protocols in place to make sure that people are getting to the bathroom safely. What happens when they faint? How does that person respond to make sure that they're positioned correctly so that somebody doesn't purge while they're fainted and choke on their purge? Because that's really the biggest risk of fainting, is that someone is temporarily unconscious and they could vomit while being unconscious. So all of those things are really important to consider when you're selecting the right practitioner to take you through this experience. And always trust your gut, because sometimes you just aren't feeling right about working with someone, and there's a lot of wisdom to that. And even if you feel like there's a sense of like urgency or scarcity, trust me when I say there are practitioners all over. Yes, they're more sparse in certain parts of the world or certain states and whatnot, but they're everywhere. And so don't just go with someone because you think it's your only opportunity to do Kambo. That's just not true. It's not worth risking your life. Wait until you have a practitioner who can answer your questions, who seems to have a good reputation and has quality training, and you feel really good in your body that you're going to be safe with them.
That makes a lot of sense. And, just I'm imagining somebody kind of learning this from doing, supposedly learning, quote unquote, learning this from like maybe doing participating in a few ceremonies themselves and then trying to be a practitioner. That just seems like quite a leap, but something that I could imagine happening that people should watch out for. That it's not the same as you've spent years, I believe, right, going back and forth between the Amazon, US.
Yeah, and I've been serving for almost 10 years. And yeah, trust me, I've made my mistakes, but um yeah, there's this trend of people trying to jump into being these facilitators of plant medicines and animal medicines and all sorts of things without having done the personal work in developing the relationship with this substance. So many people want to sign up for these trainings that have either never done Kambo or they've done it a couple of times, and I'm just, I'm like, no, that's not enough for you to really have a full scope of what type of experience you are potentially going to incur onto people. And if you're not prepared to support them with wisdom, with experience, and with a deep, deep knowledge of every expression that this medicine can deliver, then you are not ready.
Yeah, I just imagine like you haven't been in this field for 10 years, like you must have seen quite the change of the landscape. Like I don't even know how you would have found out about Kambo 10 years ago. Like that's just wow.
It was a different world back then. And, there wasn't a lot of people that were practitioners, and there was really one training organization. And, I kind of did things in a way that I don't recommend people do it. I did what a lot of people do, right? I like, had 3 sessions, received 3 sessions, also from people that had no training were just doing it, bless them. And there were definitely unsafe practices happening in that space. But I did it 3 times receiving, and then I started self-administering because like my buddy got a stick and he was self-administering and kind of taught me how to do it. And then next thing I know, my roommate's like, "Well, could I do it too?" And so then I'm doing it on her, and we're doing it together. And then a friend asked, and then a friend of a friend, and then next thing I know, I'm serving combo to strangers, and it just never slowed down. And after literally like 100 administrations on all sorts of people, which I was completely unqualified to do, and I did endanger people. I did things that I didn't even know were unsafe, and luckily nobody got hurt. But um, finally, I went and did proper training and got certification, and I'm a great example of what not to do. And back then, we didn't have as many like educational resources. We didn't have as many leaders in this space. We didn't have as many experienced practitioners out there. Now, there's no excuse. There is an abundance of options of trainings. There's online trainings as well. There's tons of people, practitioners all around the world. And so, yeah, the landscape now and then when I started is completely different, which is why I share that, because I want people to realize that we need to do it differently now. Don't be like me. Don't do it the way I did. That was reckless. There's no need to do it that way anymore. You have the support. The world knows more about combo now. And so people can do it right. Do it right. Take the time to develop your relationship. Take the time to do your inner work, and then choose a program if you're still feeling called to share that medicine with your community. Choose a program that is aligned with your values, that has integrity and reciprocity and quality, thorough education that's not all about prayer. I love prayer, I love ritual, I love the spirituality of Kambo, but we also need to balance that with the practical, with trauma informed protocols, with safety protocols, with understanding of physiology, of peptide pharmacology, and how to be medically safe as practitioners. So please, if anyone's out there wanting to be a practitioner, like, do yourself a favor, do the world a favor, and really take the time, move slow, and invest in an education that's going to serve you and all of the people that you will hold.
Mm. And I guess I know you've had both very positive experiences with working with indigenous communities and more negative experiences. If somebody wanted to sort of learn more about using Kambo in the setting where it was like initially developed, how does a person like start doing that, you know? I heard that you had worked with a tribe that it was like their second contact with the outside world. So,
Yeah, navigating contact with indigenous people is definitely tricky at times. It can be really special and really beautiful and really humbling, and it also can be really challenging. Um, and similar to like what you see in the ayahuasca world, there is a lot of really dangerous stuff that does go down in the jungle. It also, dangerous stuff is also happening in the US and in Canada and like all over the world. So I'm not saying that it's only happening in the jungle, but one of the problems with um, doing things with indigenous people is that they don't actually have a lot of education in more modern day health afflictions and drugs and medications. And so again, what's healthy for a Matsés is not necessarily what's healthy for an American. Um, so I would say make sure that you really educate yourself beforehand and choose a provider that comes recommended. Sexual assault is also a big thing in South America, right? Especially with some of these healers where they get people in these vulnerable situations under medicine. So you really have to do your research on looking for the right indigenous practitioner if that's the route that you're going to go. I would personally not recommend indigenous training as someone's primary and only form of Kambo practitioner training. I think doing a Western training is going to provide you with a lot more dense technical information, especially around safety and trauma informed consent and things like that. But once you have that education, then going into the jungle, connecting with the frog directly, connecting with the people there stewarding the land, that's also really important. So I think having both is really good for having a well-rounded education. Um, but yeah, in the jungle, it's again, there's not going to be any frill. And I think that people who come from Western cultures are actually likely to get a lot more value out of a curated container that does really utilize set and setting and intention. The jungle is certainly its own set and setting, so there's value to being in that environment. It can be really special to be surrounded by so much like plants and animals. But I don't know if I would recommend that people go to the jungle for their first few experiences. Like, if they're there, they're drinking ayahuasca, whatever, and they want to try it, go for it. But yeah, I don't know. I think this medicine has left the jungle for a reason, and there's beautiful things about being in the jungle. And as far as getting like the most value out of the experience, if you're doing it for like personal development purposes, I think having a practitioner and a container that is more attuned to your unique needs as a Westerner, I think is important.
yeah, I definitely agree with you there. It's just I think there is, you know, a lot of times, not with just Kambo, but with like all sort of, I don't want to say like psychedelic because Kambo isn't psychedelic, but a lot of these sort of medicines that are used indigenously, there's always this like seeking out of, oh, we need to structure this the way that they did it to get the maximum benefits. And maybe not. Maybe that's not the best way to work with these substances because, you know, our psychological set, if you will, is quite different. To go back to like the Native American church example, a lot of people wouldn't like being in a teepee, being told to pray and basically yelled at about the Bible, which is what can happen in a Native American church ceremony. Not all of them are like that, but many of them are. And it just, you know, constructing the framework that is most valuable for people, based on their own psychology and their intentions, I think is going to be super critical with all of these sort of out there experiences that people are interested in seeking out. So, yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, if someone wants to sit on a log and be administered Kambo and pretty much ignored the whole time and you're on your own and like good luck wandering over to the hole in the ground that you're gonna shit in, then yeah, that's an experience and it's a vibe, right? But um until someone has really like cultivated a lot of like skill in navigating that type of process and creating meaning from it, because I can create meaning, I can have a healing experience in that environment, but that's because I've worked that muscle, right? But if someone is like coming in fresh and they're just like, yeah, I don't know, and they just sit down on a log and they're just puking on their buddy's feet next to them and then passed out on a banana leaf and some indigenous child is fanning you and like making sure you're alive, to each their own. But I just think that most people would find that a bit traumatic and difficult to navigate without having already cultivated some perspective in how to move through the experience already.
Great, great. Is there anything else you think is just relevant to mention?
I think the most important thing to me is harm reduction. So, again, just emphasizing that I really want people to consider taking their time before jumping into receiving Kambo or serving Kambo and making sure that you are checking in, that you're being honest with yourself, that you are asking your practitioner the questions that help you screen them. Um, and also just not forcing a process. Kambo is not a very fun activity. And if you don't have a reason to do it, don't bother doing it. Save that medicine for someone who really needs it, who might really be ready to get the most out of that experience.
Right. All right. So we'll probably have you back on when your new study is published or something. So,
Cool. Yeah, I'd be happy to
yeah.
share the results.
All right. Cool. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
All righty. Bye.